While the whole of Europe is largely united behind Ukraine, there is one outlier that keeps delaying or even blocking decisions. The country neither supports the sanctions, continues to diligently buy Russian oil, and openly describes Putin as a close friend. We are, of course, talking about Hungary under Orban. After he was re-elected for the fifth time in 2022, he felt even more secure in the saddle and continued to cheerfully reshape the country. However, Ukraine is an important piece of the puzzle. After all, he no longer just wants to tailor the country to his political and economic interests, but also describes himself as the patron saint of all minorities abroad. And he is increasingly turning his attention to the Hungarian minority in Ukraine. What may seem rather crazy at first is actually quite systematic in Hungary. The country is one of the states that has lost the most territory. And as this has never really been dealt with, there are still repeated revanchist demands from many political directions. This involves old Hungarian territories in which the majority of the population is still Hungarian. And Orban is increasingly embracing these ideas. He is thus treading a fine line between Russia and the European Union and wants to benefit both Ukraine and Russia in the event of a victory. He is currently positioning himself for the scenario in which Russia is victorious. As a close friend of Putin, Hungary could put its long-standing plans into practice and thus change the map of Europe once again. So, let's look at his perfidious plan in detail. Why is Hungary reclaiming so many territories? Which areas are involved in detail? And what would happen if Russia actually wins? We look at all these questions in today's video. Let's get started. Let's not forget that Hungary was once one of the most powerful monarchies in Europe, especially during the era of the Kingdom of Hungary and later in the Austro-Hungarian dual monarchy. But with the First World War, this great power was quickly consigned to history. In the Treaty of Trianon in 1920, it lost more than two-thirds of its territory and around 60% of its population to the surrounding states. In addition, several million Hungarians were now living in foreign territories. This is still regarded today as a profound humiliation and represents a central trauma for Hungarian society. We could see something similar in Austria, which is why so many people long to become part of a great power again. That's why Germany had such an easy time with the Anschluss in 1938. Hungary also wanted to become part of a great power again. But unlike Austria, it wanted to become a great power itself. The recovery of Greater Hungary through the revision of the Treaty of Trianon quickly became one of the state's overriding doctrines. From the 1930s onwards, Hungary thus armed itself ever more massively and laid claim to its neighboring states. It also worked closely with Germany, which saw Hungary as a German-friendly outpost in southeastern Europe. And so Hungary, like Germany, began to annex its neighboring states bit by bit. This began in 1938 with the so-called First Vienna Arbitration Award, whereby territories with a Hungarian majority in southern Slovakia and Carpathian Ukraine were separated and awarded to Hungary. In a short war against Slovakia, at the beginning of 1939, it even took control of the entire Carpathian Ukraine. And make a note of this, because it will become important later on. However, further annexations followed during the war, such as in Romania and Yugoslavia. But the tide was soon to turn for the Axis powers. At the latest after the Battle of Stalingrad, after which the Hungarian Second Army was surrounded with 200,000 men, it was clear to Hungary that it had to find a way out. They wanted to get out of the war, but without having to give up the newly won territories. They therefore tried to switch sides and join the Allied camp. But the plan was discovered too early by the German Secret Service. And after Italy had already switched sides in 1943, Germany was determined to prevent this. So they unceremoniously invaded Hungary, occupied it, and force the Hungarians to continue fighting for them. And so the Red Army continued to advance on Hungary, which it eventually occupied. The war thus ended for the country with the surrender of the Axis powers in May 1945. Large parts of the country had been destroyed, the population had suffered heavy losses, and, worst of all for the elite, most of the territorial gains had been reversed. Hungary once again lost territory to its neighbors and was forced under the Soviet sphere of influence. Nevertheless, Hungary was not punished as severely as Germany or Austria, and was therefore not occupied or divided into occupation zones. Hungary repeatedly claimed that it actually wanted to change sides. However, the softer treatment of Hungary did not make revanchist thoughts disappear. On the contrary, they were even strengthened. For what they briefly achieved gave a foretaste of what seemed possible and strengthened the belief of many Hungarians that territorial expansion was achievable. Many Hungarians did not see themselves as the aggressor, which they had been in the first years of the war, but as victims of Hitler's manipulations. The renewed reduction in the size of Hungary was perceived as a deep humiliation and injustice. And that is why these ideas are still very present in Hungarian society today, especially in right-wing circles. The demand for the return of the old territories, especially those of Carpathian Ukraine, is heard again and again from various circles. This has gone hand in hand with the rise of Hungary's most powerful politician, Viktor Orban. At first, he seemed to have a very moderate relationship with Ukraine. When NATO decided not to include Ukraine and Georgia in the military alliance in 2008, Orban described this as a bad decision. He was still a member of the opposition at the time. However, when Orban became prime minister in 2010, he suddenly adopted a completely different tone, and relations between the two countries continued to deteriorate over the years. Orban saw himself as the patron of the Hungarian minority in Carpathian Ukraine. A major dispute broke out over a Ukrainian language law. In 2017, then Ukrainian President Poroshenko signed an education law that made Ukrainian the mandatory language of instruction from the 5th grade onwards. Previously, other languages of instruction were permitted in regions with an ethnic minority that made up more than 10% of the population. This was actually intended to push back Russian, but it also affected the Hungarian minorities. Orban saw this as an affront, and his foreign minister announced that he would block any further integration of Ukraine into NATO and the European Union. We still see that today. But it got even worse. Hungary also influenced the Ukrainian parliamentary elections of 2019 to give the Hungarian minority party more seats in parliament. In addition, a video emerged showing the Hungarian consulate distributing Hungarian passports to Ukrainian citizens in the border region. They had to swear an oath of allegiance to Hungary and sing the Hungarian national anthem. There were numerous other incidents, such as a dubious Gazprom natural gas deal, the establishment of military bases, and further demands for autonomy for Hungarians in Ukraine. As a result, relations between the two countries are pretty much on ice. And we are still seeing this relationship today, with Hungary being the only state to repeatedly block important aid to Ukraine. Orban is pursuing both a foreign and domestic policy course. Every anti-Ukrainian statement from Budapest is also an indirect declaration of loyalty to Moscow. And by demanding the return of Carpathian Ukraine, he is above all securing the loyalty of far-right voters in Hungary, who still dream of a greater Hungary. The far-right party Our Homeland is particularly in focus. This party declared at a party meeting in January that Hungary would lay claim to the western region of Ukraine if Ukraine were to lose its statehood as a result of the Russian invasion. Orban had previously said that Ukraine was a financially non-existent and no longer sovereign state due to its dependence on international support. He also knows how to provoke, as he is repeatedly photographed wearing a scarf depicting Great Hungary. As a result, the breakup of Ukraine is now being openly discussed in Hungary. A similar development is also noticeable in neighboring Romania. Various right-wing politicians there are also calling for the annexation of part of Ukraine. They are calling for Romania to be united with the territories that once belonged to Romania and now belong to Ukraine, as well as with the Republic of Moldova. These revanchist ideas are therefore becoming increasingly acceptable in Europe. It underlines once again why a Russian victory in Ukraine would be so fatal for Europe and the world. It is not just Hungary, but almost all states are still laying claim to certain regions that were once part of their own national territory. In the world order of recent decades, however, there has been a silent consensus that these disputes should either be settled or resolved peacefully. But if we start to shift more and more borders, we will quickly find ourselves back in a world order in which the law of strength applies and in which wars are the order of the day. And that poses a major problem for global security, especially with the rise of ever more extreme parties and regressive autocrats.